Today we are going to talk about using Docker with Maven. So the basic idea of a new functionality which will be introduced in 13.1 is to provide an ability to run an application and BRXM application inside of the Docker containers. There are certain features which we had to achieve because, as you know, we have a cargo plugin which allows you to run BRXM application using Tomcat container. So we had to provide full parity feature for a corresponding Docker functionality. So we were able to do that, and we were able to provide also additional features, such as now you can start your BRXM application with database containers, and during container instantiation, those containers will be linked with each other, and you won't need to have an external to use an external database, so you will have all-in-one kind of. You will be also able to bootstrap your production data into database containers, and we also provide a full development support, so you'll be able to debug your application inside of Docker containers and leverage the auto-export functionality, just like you used to have it in using cargo plugin. The development workflow has slightly changed. There is a new intermediate step. So at first, you need to build your BRXM project. Then you need to build your Docker image and run a Docker container, and then repeat all the steps if required. So let's speak about BRXM image. So BRXM image can be built using Docker build Maven profile. And certain attributes of that image are that we are using official Tomcat 9 image from Docker Hub. And the image we built is database agnostic. It means that it contains all database drivers. Well, not all, but the one we support. In particular, those are MySQL, PostgreSQL, and H2 database. It's production ready, kind of, in a sense that it doesn't contain BRXM image we create, doesn't contain any development libraries such as Essentials or auto-reload services. And we also follow Docker best practices. And as a last step, when you build your Docker image, you can also push it to your private Docker registry so that later on it could be used by your CI/CD pipeline. To give you a rough idea, I don't know if you see it, this is our sample Docker file, which we also provide with a project generated using our archetype. Yeah, and some of the Docker best practices we follow. So we try to optimize our Docker image in that way so that every time you rebuild it, the rebuild time would be minimal by adjusting image layers. So at the bottom we'll have the layers which don't usually change, such as they will contain libraries, jar files, etc. And at the top we placed artifacts which will be changed pretty frequently. So each time you rebuild your image, the most of the layers will be reused, and only top layers will be modified or changed or replaced. Those layers are usually, like I said, they contain repository data jar files, your custom code, etc. Yeah, the next step would be to run a BRXM container. And there is a corresponding Docker profile for that, and during that profile execution, we create an intermediate image based on our previously created BRXM image, which will contain the development libraries, essentials, and HCM development modules. We also mount a hosts project folder to the container, so that during auto-export operation, all files, YAML files, will be exported to your host container, to your host directory, so the data won't be lost in case if you will kill your container. Yeah, and you'll be able to rebuild the project and run container again. We also store Lucene index outside of container, so each time you restart your application, your index will not be rebuilt and will be used, the old one, which will make the deployment time shorter. Speaking of developing with a Docker, so we provide exactly the same dev experience as Cargo does. So you can debug your application, you can pass any JVM properties to it, to the JVM inside of the Docker container. So you can auto-export HCM configuration to hosts directory. Yeah. You also have a possibility to use your to point your BRXM application to use external database. There are two profiles were added starting in version 13.1. All you need to do is to define specific properties, and you are good to go. A new nice feature, which I especially like, that let's presume that you don't have a database installed at your developer machine. So now you don't really need it, because you can specify, we have two new profiles, Docker MySQL and Docker Postgres, and using those profiles, during the Docker run operation, a new database containers will be created linked with your BRXM container. So no pre-configuration required at all. And what you could also do, you could feed your database with the data, let's say from production, if you want to reproduce certain issue, bug. So you can create so you can place a SQL files into a DB Bootstrap folder inside of your project, and during database container instantiation, that data will be injected into your database. So it could be pretty convenient. And the DB data is also persisted outside of a container, so container has no data at all. And next time when you will run your configuration, then that data will be used. That is especially useful because when the database dump is big enough, so for example for HippoConnect, the time required to bootstrap all the data is about like 10 minutes, and definitely you wouldn't want to rebuild it every time you start your configuration. So this is a solution. Yeah, speaking of cargo to Docker migration, there is a like I said, there is a feature parity, and it also covers system properties. So for each cargo property, there is a corresponding Docker-related property, so the transition should be pretty smooth. Yeah. Everything is customizable, so you can customize your Docker configuration, you can customize your BRXM configuration, you can pass any properties, you can define cluster node ID, your custom cluster node ID, you can define certain JVM properties such as setting a heap size, which you want. You can customize Docker configuration, which includes customizing database versions. You can also, for MySQL database, you can customize MySQL configuration by placing my.cnf file into a Bootstrap directory, and on database initialization, that configuration file will be used. And we also provide Docker entry point and Docker files within a project created by archetype, so it's all very transparent and it can be adjusted according to the developer needs. One of the things which is also possible, instead of mounting the host's directory into a container, you can mount a Docker container, which will, especially for Mac, for system Docker running on Mac, it can boost your performance in certain cases. Yeah, and you can also tweak your environment configuration, so you can add additional containers, let's say Elasticsearch container, Nginx container, that can all work together. All you need to do is just to add a new configuration to a Maven profile. That's all you need to do. Yeah, so that was the functionality we have by now. The next steps we are looking into to provide more fine-grained control to customize BRXM application. We also are looking forward to implement a pure Docker solution using Docker Compose. So imagine if, let's say, a front-end developer who is not very familiar with the Java world, but he wants to develop something for BRXM product, BRXM-based product. The idea of that pure Docker functionality is that developer doesn't really need to have a Java installed at his machine. He doesn't need to deal with a Maven. All he needs to do is just to invoke Docker Compose command, and during that command execution, a new container will be instantiated. It will build a project. So all you need to do is just to check out the project locally. And then a new container will be instantiated, your project will be built, a new BRXM image will be created, and then you can run it without actually having need to install Java. And the last thing we want to do is a Kubernetes support. So we want to provide an ability to run a cluster of BRXM applications locally. So that can be useful in certain cases, and it would be more close to a production environments. So yeah.
Yeah, and just to be clear, these things here, especially the Docker Compose and Kubernetes stuff, we've done like proof of concept on this, so we know it's possible to try it out. But we weren't totally sure on when we wanted to release it until, so we decided to get the first basic Docker support out, give it to the community, get some feedback on whether we've set up the Docker file in an appropriate way. If there's any common tweaks that you guys want to make, get some tickets opened against it, and then we'll move on to adding some other layers of support on top once we get some experience with it.
I think the Docker Compose is a very good idea. I mean, I just checked back on my blog in 2014. I was playing around with this idea as well. And I created a Maven plugin for Docker and ran into the fact that Docker changes its API all the time. So you rely on a plugin like this and rely on Maven doing all the all the directions for you and then communicating with Docker, it's going to break a lot. So actually, using the interface of Docker Compose helps with an extra layer of redirection and probably makes the whole thing a bit more stable for you.
Yes.
And when it comes to Kubernetes, maybe you want to talk to these guys because they did a full-blown Kubernetes implementation with one of your customers. So maybe you want to hook up with them as well.
Yeah, and we're also using Kubernetes already for our Bloomreach Cloud implementation. So we do have some experience using it. But what we found is that it's still pretty finicky. Like,
it is.
There's some major differences between versions of Kubernetes and upgrade kind of teething issues.
Kubernetes was meant for stateless services. And Bloomreach is one thing, it's definitely not stateless.
Yes.
With the whole machine index and all. So.
Yes, exactly. And making sure that we have a good story to tell around how do you deal with backups in a large clustered environment. That we weren't quite confident that we had all the details right on that, so we're not publishing that in 13.1 just yet.
So at what time are we going to do the switch? For example, switching over from Maven, from Cargo to the Docker.run profile?
Well, it's up to you as a developer.
Okay, so I have an optional choice. It's not there.
For 13.1, the Cargo stuff and the Docker stuff will both be available in new projects that you generate. So
they will be supplied to the market, like
yeah. So the main thing that you have to do if you have an existing project is basically copy over the Docker file and the entry point script from a new archetype project.
It's not all. You'll have to copy slightly more resources, but it's just like a copy-paste operation, so nothing difficult.
But eventually, the Cargo.run profile will be deprecated, right?
We're still debating that, actually. Sergey can talk a little bit about the performance differences.
Yes, that's what I wanted to ask. Is there a difference in performance switching over?
Yes. Well, yes and no. If you are running Linux on your host operating system, then there is no performance difference between Cargo and Docker.
There is no virtual.
If you're running on Mac, then a virtual machine is used to support Docker, and then you have a performance penalty. But it's not that critical. It's comparable to a Cargo performance. So if you have a really strong point to use Docker, then in certain cases it might be just more simple. Then you won't really notice the difference.
I think it wasn't Mojave, but the one before that, macOS exposed APIs for their actual hypervisor. So nowadays Docker actually talks to the Mac hypervisor instead of instantiating a virtual box. So the performance hits like 2 or 3%. You won't notice it. Unless you're loading Hippo Connect website, I guess.
Yes, and unless you're dealing with the multiple files on your host's system.
Okay, there's like 3 phases, right? There's the clean verify, then there's the Docker build, and then now there's the Docker run.
Yes, and it's not verify anymore. That's the distinction, because the way how we create a Docker image, we rely on artifacts deployed to a local Maven repository, so we have to use Maven install.
Has to do with the plugin that you chose to use, right?
Actually, the assembly, it's the Maven assembly.
Well, it's a Docker Maven plugin which internally uses Maven assembly plugin, so yes.
Yeah, because this was, I know the guy who built this, there was a huge debate between me with my plugin and him with his plugin, that's why we didn't decide to merge.
Oh, yeah, and the way we use assembly, we try to use existing assembly files which are used to create a distribution as much as possible. Very thin layer of Docker-related assembly files on top of the base assembly.
You can fix this, I think, if you would make the thingy that produces the Docker artifacts a separate submodule. Then you can actually make a dependency on the top, or you can make a project next to it, depends on it, and then you should be able to resolve those artifacts.
Okay, yeah.
That's a bit.
Yeah, I dug into the whole issue because way in the weeds of how Maven does
It's
it.
a bit argued as if it's installed to your local repo, because that will, if you're going with snapshot builds, there's all kinds of ways where some of your local Maven stuff might break if you install snapshots into your own repo. So now you're actually telling people to do that. Yeah. That's why you always want to package or verify instead of install. So it goes against Maven common practice or maybe best practice.
Yeah, I guess there is still a room for an improvement. Yeah, and maybe at some step we'll get rid of using assemblies at all, because it was used for convenience, but there is no real need of doing that in that way. But on the other hand, it would make our Docker file bigger, but because we would now assembly copies all resources we need into a single folder or a set of folders, but now we just need to gather them individually. But that's possible, definitely, yeah.
Will this also replace the way we currently create distributions? Like, for example, we had this -p
dist. It depends from your deployment workflow. So if you operate with the Docker images, then it might, it would make sense to use Docker profiles. But if you don't use Docker, then -p dist is your only option to create a distribution.
But from a certain point, we're going to create the archetype to run with this. Are we going to deprecate then the -p dist, or just have the kind of
No.
Yeah, same story as with Docker.
Okay.
We're just adding, not removing.
Okay.
Yeah, and Bloomreach Cloud is not planning on switching over to allowing Docker images directly, because they build and control their own Docker image. So they really want to make the layer. They want to make their interface the distribution file with the wars in it, and not the whole container, because they add all kinds of extra infrastructure around the CMS that they want to put into the container that they build.
I'm guessing as well, if I would start up locally as well, that WPM and Elasticsearch, or in this case Command for WPM, will also run in containers.
Yeah, if you use the enterprise release palm, then there's a docker.es profile also that kicks up the Elasticsearch instance.
Container settings as well, instead of going into the plugin of Elasticsearch, Maven, etc.
Yeah, and all of the advantages of Docker, being able to pick up a new version of the default public image, all that stuff is a lot easier when you're isolating the product itself in the container. So we have grand visions of sometime in the future doing that with our product also, so that it could be an image you start off with instead of gathering everything from the Maven repository. But getting from here to there is a pretty big step. So we thought we'd start with the developer experience. So you basically run the project like you always have, but now it's just a little easier to work with production native and take baby steps towards actually shipping your product as it.
This Docker image that you created, that we need like supported way to run Bloomreach inside of Docker?
Yeah, so what we're doing is providing a default Docker file, which does all the basic stuff that people run into. So at least you won't fall in the face the first time you try to do it, but we fully expect people to customize the hell out of it, have their own logging system, their own whatever. So at least for the near future, we say we're going to support running on Docker just like we support running on Linux. But if you have an easier configuration issue, there are other chances. We're just going to help you figure out if there's something specific about your CMS configurations.
That would probably be really nice, because it would be that if you would have like this base image, you have like this on-build step that you can then extend. So you can say, okay, well, this is the general stuff that you at least need to have, and you can extend on that. At least the base image you can have control and say, okay, well, that is supported by us, And if you add CNS in the side of more, that will be done using magic like on build, and then after that you can just add stuff to your image.
Yeah, so there's still some debate in the community about whether the on-build images are going to stay or not. So that was another reason why we decided not to step into that just yet. OpenShift has a totally different approach to doing like source to image builds. So we're still trying to figure that out. And not just with Docker, but I think how we package and ship our product is a big thing that we just, especially for partners, we want to make it easier to start from scratch and get running as quickly as possible. And if more and more developers actually being front-enders first and back-enders only when necessary, we need to sort of lower the barrier to entry.
And also, I see Kubernetes there, I see Docker, I'm like, all this whole stateless thing screams about moving maybe to a persistent machine image like Elasticsearch or something, instead of this file system has to be jerked around, and that's probably quite a change in the product, but might be benefits too.
Yeah, and there are workarounds in practice, like our enterprise version includes the reducing import-export feature that we rely on for Bloomreach Cloud. We thought about building that into this image, but it's one of the things that we did this sprint. But it's something you can add relatively. So yeah, definitely this is version 1 of Docker.
Yeah, and now I created a sample project, instantiated it using Docker, instantiated application using Docker profile, and installed the blocks plugin from Essentials. Now I'm rebuilding all and restarting the application. So now we are in Docker build phase. Yeah, and the creation of Docker image took 8 seconds in my machine. Not that much, though. Yes, because we mount a host, your host operating system directory, which contains your project actually, to a container. So container has access to your project files. And during auto-export operation, it just saves files to a disk. But in reality, they're being saved at your hosts.
If you ever looked at the cargo profile, it passes in the project base there as a system property. And we just do the same thing, except the project base there is like /VRSM. So it's from the perspective of the container, where in the container's file system, and basically everything just works the same.
So also, for example, testing upgrades, the storage folder, it doesn't do the same thing.
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, by default, the storage folder is outside on the host system.
Okay, we have about application. Yeah, so it's done. Yeah. More questions? Okay, so thank you.
Thank you.